So the final topic we're going to talk about for exam 3 is going to be on pro-social helping behavior. And one thing I've always tried to make clear is that it's intuitive to believe that the topic we just talked about, aggression and pro-social behavior, are the opposite sides of the same coin. So it's very common to think that, like, oh, if aggression goes up, pro-social behavior must go down. And there's a lot to that idea, right? Because it makes some sense that if you're helping someone, you're not hurting them at the same time. And they are often negatively correlated with each other. However, it's not that simple. And we're going to see that there are sometimes shared processes, like we'll talk about some of the media stuff in a second, or at the end of this lecture. But there's also some very different processes going on here. Okay, so even though it's intuitive to think that it's not the case, let me give you an example of where you can have a case where you have a behavior that's both helping and hurting at the same time. In your book, there's a term that they talk about called instrumental aggression. And instrumental aggression is the idea that you hurt someone with a much bigger, loftier goal. Now, as it pertains to combining pro-social and aggressive behaviors, let me give you a clear example of how you can aggress against someone with a different goal in mind besides hurting them. So I once had a research assistant who served, I think, like 2 or 3 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. And he told me that when what would happen is sometimes when they would go by these Iraqi villages, sometimes mothers would purposefully slap their little children, which is, all right, so that's obviously an aggressive behavior. The kid would cry. The intent was to harm them. But the reason they would slap their kids is because the kids would be crying, and then the mother would like extend their hands to get like money or food or some sort of handout or something like that, some sort of charity. And so even though slapping someone is aggressive behavior, the overall intent was to get money or food so that they could care for their children. And that is definitely a pro-social or a helpful behavior. So it was this interesting idea that that kind of came about from that. And that's the idea that even though aggression and helping are often negatively correlated, they're not exactly the opposite sides of the same coin. All right. So let's first just so pro-social behavior is helping people, and the first thing we have to do is figure out, why do we help others? So what theories kind of predict when helping does or does not occur? And the first, to me, is the most intuitive one, and that's going to be what's called social exchange theory. And the idea behind social exchange theory is you're playing this like economic game in your mind where you see a situation, you're trying to decide, do I help? And what's going to happen here with do you help is it's going to be if you can maximize benefits and minimize costs. So let's talk about costs and benefits. What we mean here is whenever you make a decision to help somebody, you have to weigh the pros and cons of helping. The pro, that would be like a benefit, and the con, that would be the cost. And so, for example, let's take an example of me. So when I was in middle school and high school, and even later elementary school, I got bullied like every day. All right. And so the question then is, how come, if someone sees me being bullied, right? The question is, do they intervene? And when you're deciding whether or not to intervene, you have to figure out what's the cost and what's the benefit from helping. So, one cost if you help someone who's getting bullied, one is that you'll feel good. Number 2 cost is that you'll get their admiration. So let's just tally this up. So we got, this is going to be pros, this is going to be cons in this example. So number 1, once again, is you'll feel good because you're a helpful person. Number 2 is you will have my admiration, so you'll get a friend. All right. Number 3, maybe you'll look like a hero to somebody. Okay. However, what are some cons? Well, number 1 is then you could get beaten up. All right. Another con is that you could get made fun of for helping me, the nerdy small kid. Another con is that it takes some time to do that. It takes time to help me, right? Um, and then let's say another con would be that your social status, your popularity, that may go down because you're helping me, the less popular kid. So if you just look at this, what you see is you have 3 pros, 4 cons, so you're not going to help. All right? And that's the way social exchange theory works. Now, one thing I do want to point out before we go over some examples of pros and cons that the literature has shown, one thing I want to say is that these pros and cons, the way I have this presented is it looks like, they cancel each other out. Like, so you have 3 here, you have 4 here. That means you have a net score of -1. 3 minus 4 is -1. So you're not going to help. But that assumes that each of these pros and each of these cons, that assumes that they're equal in weight. All right, and we know that's not the case. All right, so for example, having an increase in your self-esteem, that may be worth 1. Let's say having my admiration may be worth 1. Let's say that other people may see you as a hero, maybe that's worth 2. So now instead of 3, you have 4 because you weighted this one as worth 2. But if you are afraid of getting beat up, maybe that's worth 4 in of itself. And then the time, that's another 1. The other reasons we came up with. So maybe what's going to happen is the weighting system isn't actually -1. In this case, it'd be -3, right? 4 minus 7 is -3. Now, who determines the weights of each of these factors? And that's going to be you. All right, you determine whether or not something's important to you or not. So take me. I was a very short, small kid. If I saw someone getting bullied, would I help? Well, the answer for me was probably no, to be honest, because for me, if I was to intervene, I would probably get beaten up. And to be honest, that's worth like 6 to me, or whatever the weighting system happens to be. That's worth 6 cons. So what's going to happen is you determine the weights for this economic game that you play. All right. So let me show you some. These are some kind of results that the literature has shown regarding the benefits. So number 1, and we already talked about some of these, but let's make this formal. Number 1 is reciprocity. So the idea here of reciprocity is that if you do me a favor, I do you a favor. So if you helped me, I am now in your debt. So it's very mob-like or mafia-like, right? Where it's like, you owe me one. But needless to say, that's what reciprocity is. The second is you relieve personal distress. Research has shown that if you feel guilty about something, or if you feel bad or whatever, if you feel distress, then helping makes you feel a little bit better. So have you guys seen those people outside of like the grocery store or Walmart around Christmas time, and they ring their little bells and they're for the United Way and they want some money. They want some money. And what's going to happen is if you feel guilty, then you're going to be more likely to put money in that little change thing that they ring the bells for. And that's going to make you feel better. Now, it's not going to relieve your guilt, but at least your negative affect will go down. And then finally, you get rewards. So like we talked about, social approval. Sometimes you get money for helping people. Your self-esteem goes up. Like there's all these rewards. And these are all pros. Like these are the reasons why people would help. However, there are cons, and helping decreases when there's some kind of cost to you. So number 1 is if it takes too long. Number 2 is if it puts you in physical danger. And then number 3 is if it puts you in some sort of, if it brings you embarrassment or brings you pain, stuff like that. Now, we already talked about this as it relates to bullying, stuff like that. The takes too long thing, this is an interesting one. Research has shown that if you're in a hurry or you're late for something, you're just not going to help people. All right. So this is social exchange theory. And what you do is, once again, you do your pros and cons. And this is not by any means an exhaustive list of pros and cons that I have up here. There are others that could be at play here. Regarding when we do or do not help. And once again, you determine the weights of what is important when you're making this decision. Now, does this sound like a high effort or a low effort process? All right, well, this is a very high effort process. You are literally doing like math in your head to figure out if you're going to help. Now so it's one of those things where we do have to put in the time and the effort and the energy to do this. All right. So this is one theory, social exchange. Another theory is what's called the empathy altruism hypothesis. And the idea here is it's centered around the idea of empathy. So let's define empathy. Empathy is when you vicariously feel someone else's emotions. All right. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you are having a normal average day. You go back to your dorm room and you see your roommate crying, and you ask them what's wrong, and they tell you what's wrong. And if you're a highly empathic person, let's say they're sad about something. Let's say they're sad because their grandmother just died. All right. Now let's pretend for a second that they tell you this, they're crying, they're really sad. You start to cry. Now you've never met this grandmother before. You don't know anything about them. However, because you feel sad for your friend or for your roommate, and that's what empathy is. It's vicariously feeling someone else's emotions, right? And that's what this theory is centered around. So let me show you this figure. So this is by Baumeister and Bushman. There's a lot going on with this theory. Okay, so I need to define one more term as we go through this. All right, so we already defined empathy. Let's define what's happening here. This is called perspective taking. Perspective taking is basically, can you put yourself in someone else's shoes? Can you see through their eyes? Now, the only way that we can perspective take is if we have experienced it before. So in the example with your roommate's grandmother dying, if you have also lost a grandmother, right, then you will know how sad it is, and you will know what they're feeling. You can put yourself in their shoes because you've experienced that before. All right, that's what perspective taking is. If you have never lost a grandmother, all right, in this example, if you've never lost a grandmother, you cannot technically accurately perspective take. All right, you have to, in order to put yourself in someone else's shoes, you have to experience the same thing. All right, so that's what perspective taking is. So what this theory says, all right, it starts here. Someone needs help. The first question, and this is how the model starts, is can you perspective take? If the answer is yes, you can. So you've done it before. Then what happens is that starts you off. You will experience empathy. You will vicariously feel what they're feeling. That's going to lead to a motive. Your motivation is going to be to help someone, purely to help them. And then what's going to happen is you're going to help. All right. Altruism. Let's define that real quick. All right. This is helping unselfishly. So you help with no kind of, you help not for the sake of you, but for the sake of them. So what happens here is if, let's say your friend's grandmother died and you also lost a grandmother, you can now perspective. So they need help. They're crying. You can perspective take. Yes. You're going to feel empathy. You're going to be motivated to help them because you genuinely want to help. And then the behavior that ensues is you will help. Right? Now let's go down this route. What happens if you can't perspective take? You've never lost a grandmother. Instead of empathy, you're going to feel personal distress. So you're going to feel bad. Not because you're experiencing their emotions, but because you legitimately feel bad. And so your motive is now going to be egoism. You want to help because you feel bad. It's not about them, it's about you. And the question is, are you going to help? Well, look at this question mark. That means maybe. If you are going to help, it's to relieve your own distress. It has nothing to do with the other person. So I want to say that even if you cannot perspective take, so you're in this route here, you may still help. All right? But you also may not. Here, you will help. All right? And all this starts with is perspective taking. That's all you have to do, and that's what makes this cool. When we do our applied day online, what will happen is we'll go through an example of how this works in the real world to talk about how perspective taking literally starts us on the trajectory of helping people.